thank you for joining, and thank you for being on time. We all know that Teams is absolutely going gangbusters across the world. Microsoft has seen the growth in the 30x in some markets, but it certainly has seen about a 50% growth in just 6 months, in the recent 6 months. And that came very much on the tail end of people rushing to just grab whatever they had, often Zoom, and then people recognizing, as Shelley and I were just talking about, the fact that your budgets are going to be consumed by these new collaboration tools. So people were looking around often for the new collaboration tool that they wouldn't have to pay for or wouldn't have to pay as much. Teams was the obvious landing point there. But Teams does more than just video comms, and that's really where the challenge is. Today, if you've got a question, or if you disagree with something, or if something's not quite making sense to you, please just unmute yourself and interrupt and ask the question. I would much rather this be a really, really practical discussion that answers your questions, especially since we've got a nice tight group like this. So the objectives for today, from my perspective, are to explore the need for the governance around Microsoft Teams. But also what I'd like is to leave you with some ideas about how to quickly determine your governance policies and practices. Some of you may have already started this journey and you're wanting to validate it. Some of you might be on the very, very early stages of it. Wherever you are, please ask some questions. We won't get too far into the deep technical issues. That's not the purposes of today, but there are a couple of things which will, by necessity, get a little bit technical. So I apologize for that in advance. So the first thing I want to point out is that Teams is very disruptive, but it's not actually Teams that's disruptive. It's any of the new collaboration platforms. And they've been disruptive well before COVID. It's the rate at which they've been taken up because of working from home, that's actually caused this disruption become very, very prevalent now. A few things that these tools do. First of all, they flatten your organizational hierarchy, and this is often not understood well enough. When you flatten organizational hierarchy, you change how people, and not just how people communicate with each other, but whom they communicate to, and how much empowerment they have to make decisions, either individually or as a group, and how those decisions are then checked. What is the approval process for decision making? That gets highly consolidated into a flatter hierarchy. We actually saw this once before, but it took almost 20 years to really cut in. And that was the move from the mainframe mindset of big institutional decision-making that was very hierarchical to the desktop network mindset. But that gave us really 20, 25 years. Email is another big point that changed the way that organizations function. And that, again, flattened the hierarchy to some degree. But we've been using that for 25 years. And if you think back to the introduction of email, it was disruptive, but it wasn't disruptive as a technology. It was disruptive as how to send an email without cheesing people off. What is the email etiquette and so forth. This all is a result of that flattening of the hierarchy. I don't think we're going to go back. I think these collaboration tools are definitely here to stay, whether you're working in the office or remote or from home or whatever, they're here to stay. So this new organizational structure is really going to come in. The other thing which happens, and this is, again, leading edge companies are recognizing this now. Trailing edge companies are just starting to see this reported. But as you use these new communications tools, as you do more collaboration with these tools, you're actually measuring people's performance at a much more granular level. I participated in a Microsoft focus group, I guess you'd call it, a couple of months ago on their performance manager directions. In other words, all of these tools are instrumented. Microsoft has got a huge amount of information about explicitly what people are doing with these tools and when they're doing them and what the impact is of that and what's the knock-on impact. And that's all in their cloud logs, of course. But now organizations are wanting to get access to that information, and Microsoft is starting to turn that on. Now, how much of that information should be shared? How do you measure people in this new world? Do you measure them by the number of meetings they attend or how many notes were taken in that meeting and so forth? You can get very, very fine-grained. We are at just really a brand new beginning and thinking about HR performance measurement. And it's not going to be without pain, as Microsoft has seen in Europe recently, where there was a huge pushback for some of those performance measurement tools I was just talking about. They've had a huge pushback on that. The other thing is this notion of borderless working. Now, I don't just mean working from home. I actually mean fundamentally changing how we think about who does work. So in the past, when you work with a client or a supplier, there was a very clear delineation. You would hand information to them, they might do something with it, and they would hand it back. But now that can be broken with this idea of guest access, and we will go well beyond that in the future. It also changes hiring practices. I've spoken to a number of HR execs who are saying they now recognize that they can actually reduce salaries by up to 20% by hiring people not in the local zone of the office, but spreading that search out to all the way to rural areas. And we've got some organizations now that are explicitly breaking down their hiring to embrace remote workers because they're cheaper. But the other interesting thing is some of the folks have been doing this for a long time, 5-6 years. There are organizations there. They're actually showing us that they've got higher retention rates of staff, which is another big cost factor. So this idea of the borderless working is beyond just thinking working from home. It really is working with your partners, working with your new types of staff hiring, so forth. Information storage is decentralized. So all the collaboration tools enable you to share information, which means you can't guarantee where information is going to be at any one point in time. And that's particularly tricky with Teams, because even within Teams, even within the Microsoft ecosystem, your information is scattered all over your Office 365 environment, potentially beyond. The other thing is that information lifecycles change. What I mean by that is, in the past, we had this. I'm sorry, someone was just making a comment. Nope. Any questions? No? Okay, we'll move on. In the past, our information lifecycle was very much a check-in, check-out sort of approach. Somebody would work on a document. It might be checked into an IBRS, or it might be emailed on. It would be then reworked on and passed back. Occasionally, you'd have the document go into two directions, in which case people would then try and pull that information back together. But it was very much a serial approach. In the new world with co-authoring, we are seeing examples of where not just 2 or 3 people are working on the same document without having to check in, check out. It's one document. We're seeing hundreds of people potentially working on this. And when that goes beyond the organizational boundary, things get extremely interesting. That fundamentally breaks how many information management scientists think about information management life cycles. How do you determine when something is going to be, just one moment, my phone is going crazy. How do you think about when something is going to be archived in that environment? You know, that's one of the simplest things, but it's an issue that we need to consider, that these type of collaboration tools fundamentally break information management as we know it. So questions on that or feedback? Richard, I'm just allowing you to, I'm just putting you onto the ability to speak. Noreen, do you have a comment?
No, but I'm interested in that information lifecycle changes, because obviously my background is information records management. So that's my that's my interest in all of this.
Right.
The storage decentralized, yeah, I mean, we have that, but we've got a third-party tool that manages our content.
Interesting.
So
I would love to see what you've got. What is
it? We're using Records 365.
Records 365.
From RecordPoint.
Yep. No RecordPoint. Very well.
Yeah.
Great little Australian success story. Yay.
Yes. Yeah, no, it is. It's working well for us. Although we've got so many teams, we haven't got all of them added as yet. And I've got to build some strategy around which sites we do manage and which we decide not to.
Great. I'm going to come back to you because that is one of the things that we're going to discuss. So that's the disruption. That is why we need governance. You've got all of these things going on, and we need to rethink some of new government policies, for example, around this idea of borderless, but we also need to think around some existing things such as information management. So we do require, and you see, that's the big one. We actually need new information leakage, protection, and access controls. Okay, so look, areas for consideration. This slide was really put there because I think a lot of people try to bite Teams off as one big product. And like SharePoint, it's actually a whole bunch of different services that come together very tightly. You've got Teams themselves, which is the highest level. In other words, it's a grouping of people who work on something. One of the things that needs to be considered is, how are you going to organize those teams? Are they going to be organized around business practices? Are they going to be organized around processes? Are they going to be organized around division? In other words, the structure of the organization. What does that look like? That's a really important discussion that you need to have. And the reason for it is your organization, rather Teams, will put in place the new flatter organization structure over time. The organization will slowly change to how you start talking back to the organization about grouping, which is Teams. Now, that's not because of Teams software is changing the organizational structure. It's rather this new way of working will extend beyond the Teams environment. It's actually the reverse. It's not cause and correlation. It's correlation and cause. So I think that we need to be, we'll talk about that a little bit. Channels are the channels of communication that you have within that. So you can have, I think it's 500,000 teams, and within each of those, you can have 200 channels per team. So you can see that your information fragmentation can get out of control real fast if you're not careful. Private chats are particularly challenging. And was it Shelley? You mentioned that you've got some concerns around how information is shared on chats. Was that correct?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Given that the chat logs are held in APAC, that's a concern for us at the moment. I know that will change, but Microsoft are working on that. Can I just ask a question?
Sure.
I've got you. The one-to-one relationship is team to SharePoint. It's not channel to SharePoint.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, absolutely.
Cool.
The channel information. So there's a slide I've got which shows where things are, but you're correct. Yes.
Okay, good. You had me worried there with 200 channels.
Okay. The other thing which is worth considering, and I don't see enough people talking about it yet, including Microsoft, is the apps that you can either have as a corporate standard, the apps that can be connected into Teams, or the fact that people can connect other apps into Teams relatively easy. And these apps will be other points of data, other silos of data. They also, as we've seen with recently with, for example, SolarWinds, they present a potential supply, what they call kill chain risk. Now, I'm not saying turn off apps. I think apps are an incredibly important part and often overlooked part of Teams, but they need to be done very, very carefully and sensitively. So any questions before we move on? Yep. Okay. So here are the architectural considerations. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because, like I said, I don't want to dive down too much into the technical detail. But if you look at this chart, what you realize is, yes, Teams is a very fragmented storage environment. You need to think of Teams as really an umbrella that sits over a whole bunch of different services. And those services by default run into different areas. Of course, if you've got apps added to this, you've got another number of layers to this as well. But here's the challenge that I see in terms of compliance. And I'm only going to look at the archival compliance issue here, or the information, taking information away and protecting for X number of years, whatever that life cycle looks like. It really only readily supports out of the box messages and images that are in your basic Teams. Everything else, there's a big question mark on where that's going to go. And you need to be looking at tools or processes to manage that compliance outside of Teams. Now, you probably have some of these tools already, but you need to do that mapping. That's the key thing I wanted you to take from this slide. Any questions on this?
The files chat OneDrive for Business link, is that to the individual's OneDrive for Business? Where does it go in OneDrive, the chat files?
Okay, my understanding,
files attached.
that's a good question. My understanding is that you can actually point it in either direction. Either that's in place now or it's about to be. Otherwise, I think it by default goes into the user folder.
The user who sent the file.
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
That's my current understanding. As I said, some of this is a little hard to dig into and get answers from. I am planning to have a session with Microsoft, a Microsoft product manager, and actually interview them with a panel of people who want to ask them these tough questions. Because some of these things, when I talk with Microsoft, incidentally, one of the other things aside from this, so that you know where Microsoft is on this product journey, all of those services that you see on that page, some of them use the unified identity management inside O365, and some of them use their own identity management. Now, that sounds really minor, but actually you can see that this is a fragmented bunch of very different services developed by different teams that have been smooshed together. And their roadmap, Microsoft's roadmap on this, is evolving very, very quickly. They're trying to bring it into a more uniform environment, but we have to be honest with ourselves. It's not. And sometimes Microsoft doesn't have all the answers. Certainly last year, late year before last, before COVID hit us, I actually sat down in Redmond with some of the product teams and we talked about this stuff. And the identity management behind this is really messy. But you never get to see that. Rarely get to see that. That's the good point. So does that answer the question, Nori?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was my question, but that's all right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Whose question was that?
It was Shelley, I think.
I'm sorry, Shelley.
Name I saw coming up.
Okay, got it. I was just looking on the little marks on the screen. Sorry about that. Sorry, Shelley. Okay.
No, it's all good.
So look, let's move on to the better practices. Now, I'm using the word better practices here, not best, because one, the product's changing very fast, and two, IBRS actually doesn't believe that there is a best practice for anything. Because of change, but also because different organizations need to look at what can work and then apply it to them. I see here that we've got people from very different types of organizations. And so some of you will have different compliance needs, different security sensitivities, different risk profiles. When we go through these, I'm going to be talking about them not as absolutes, but as things you need to look at and consider so that you can create your own governance frameworks. And again, please speak up and ask questions about how this might apply. So I've broken it down by a couple of key areas. The first is provisioning teams. Now, I don't mean technically rolling out teams. I mean looking at the team's structure, the grouping structure, the highest level grouping structure, and saying, how do we create teams and who gets to create them? And here's the problem. If you can have up to 500,000 teams in a Teams environment, 500 groupings of people. Some larger organizations have reported back that when they allow anyone to create a team, they end up with multiple teams doing the same thing. So you might have a team from HR and you might have another team that's doing a different part of HR, and two of those things should actually be the one team. So this is a fundamental question about how do you see the business being structured. Remember that flattening of the hierarchy. How do you see the business working in 10 years' time? It's a really, really tough discussion. One of the principles that we seem to be hearing from organizations who are doing some deeper thought into this is teams should match the work to be done, not the hierarchy of the organization. So, for example, if you're a legal entity, a legal firm, you might structure your teams by cases, or you might structure your teams by practices and then break down into channels to use cases. A government department might decide that they're going to do this by process. So, for example, the submission of a development request would be of a significant size, might be a separate team. This has a lot of impact across all of the rest of the organization going forward. All these other governance practices actually relate back to this one issue. So the questions which we think that people should be asking is, who can set up a team? If you're going to have a highly regimented environment where you don't want just anyone and everyone creating teams and you potentially creating pockets of information that you don't know about, then you need to have a structured approach for a very rigorous guardrails for who can actually start up a team. How the team's templated. Will there be a standard model for specific types of teams if they're a process-based team? The other question is, who's the owner of the team versus the member? And this sounds a bit weird. It's really about admin rights. Think of the owner as somebody who can invite other people to the team willy-nilly, including potentially external guests. Is that an IT function because you want to lock down that guest access very, very tightly? Or is this a business function? Or is it something between the two? Some of the organizations that we interviewed and were in our roundtables in the past, what we saw is some interesting approaches to address this. One of them was they used simple workflow tools, an eForms tool. In one case, it was Power Apps. There was another example where they used just a SharePoint form. When a business unit or a business person, stakeholder, wants to create a new team for something that they are working on, they fill in a form, and that is automatically set up for them. But by doing that, they have to answer some critical questions, which sets the parameters on how that Teams is going to be deployed, who can get in there, what their usage rights are, and so forth. But more importantly, it flags to the IT department and the information management group of the IT department specifically that there's been another team created and it needs to be monitored. So that was an interesting approach. It was trying to balance, let the business take control without having to force the IT department to have massive overhead, but also giving them full visibility. The other approach is to reduce the number of team owners through automation or third-party tools. And there are tools out there which you can use to, if you will, apply an ownership governance policy across teams, or even to find the teams that you might not be aware of. I think the overall attitude is consider that team owners are effectively admin people. They have an administration right. If you view them that way, you actually realize how much power they've really got. And then you can start putting policies to manage that. However, smaller organizations with a high level of digital maturity, let the staff take control, because all the other stuff I've just talked about is actually quite time intensive to put together. So any questions on that one or feedbacks?
We haven't. We are looking at putting in a provisioning tool for us, but we've actually had we're developing one.
Oh, you're developing one. Okay.
Yeah.
How are you developing it? For the rest
It's
of the
through Power Apps and Power Automate, I think.
Yep.
So I'm not involved. I mean, I'm involved in the outcome, but not in the actual development. It's a bit on the technical side for me. But yeah, we are developing one. We did have one when we had SharePoint on-prem.
Right.
So we're trying to, and that sort of the various questions we have is the type of site, whether it's a project, a committee, a team. So we will have similar questions, and we do have templates for each of those different types of sites or teams. I say sites because I see it as SharePoint. Even within Teams, it's just easier. I know what I'm talking about.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
So it does seem to be that is a growing, becoming a bit of a favored approach. Personally, I think it's a workaround to something which should actually be in Teams. And I again, speaking to Microsoft, I know that they're thinking about this on the horizon. However, Microsoft benefits from not having it there and having people do this themselves, or having a template, maybe a prepackaged template that uses Power, the Power Platform, because that drives use of the Power Platform. So think about Microsoft's strategy in growing their revenue as well. Okay, let's move on then to Teams Lifecycles. And this is the other one that stems off who controls teams and who builds them and who provisions them. Not all teams need to last forever. And if an organization, if your organization is planning to use Teams as a project or a case management sort of approach, if you're structuring it on those work processes, you need to make sure that you can identify teams that are no longer active or are underutilized, and then either archive them or apply some sort of information management rule to them. So the general principle that we think is a better practice is teams last only as long as the work they do. Now, some of those teams might last, they might be departmental, they might be structured around the business, an ongoing business activity, in which case they're going to last forever. As long as work is being done on them, they should be alive. After that, kill them. So the questions that stem from that would be, how will the organization define teams that are continuous versus temporary? That comes back to that first provisioning question. Who defines the life cycle of teams? Now, this is a really tricky one because we had a lot of differences of opinion. Some organizations that we spoke to are saying this is absolutely 100% the role of the information management team, or whoever, whichever stakeholders manage the EDRMS, that sort of environment. Others of them are saying, no, this is 100% a business decision, and this needs to be an entirely different policy separate from information management. I tend to be more towards this needs to be managed like information management because there's a lot of strong parallels, but I do appreciate there's going to be differences of opinion and different organizations will need to take a different approach. The other question, the big question from a technologist point of view is, okay, what happens when we decide that this team is no longer needs to be alive? We need to wrap it up. How does that all get archived? Where does that information go? Who has access to that information, and so forth? So the better practices, automated alerts for Teams Lifecycle. Now, that can be one of two things. At the simplest level, when a team is created, there is a calendar entry on an IT person to say, please review this. Team is still running and is still active, and if it's not, close it down. It was literally a manual update request. Some other folks have tried to automate this, but I haven't seen a lot of that happening. But it does this idea of having an alert after a period of time to say, check in on this. There is also this concept of Teams retention expiry policy that's built into Microsoft. It's very primitive at this stage, and I haven't heard too many organizations embrace it fully because there's so much risk associated with handing over that expiry policy to something which is still fairly new, well, fairly immature. It's probably a better way of saying it. And also, I think the key thing and the easiest thing for everyone to do here is take a look at your archival policies that are coming out of the information management team and overlay them to Teams. Overlay them just to the information that is sitting inside these teams, these major groupings. So thoughts and feedback on that?
We've been using AvPoint for SharePoint to
Yes.
control the lifecycle and the provisioning. And that's not bad. It seems a bit cumbersome, and but it does seem to work reasonably well with the trigger points for people to reconfirm the
Yes.
existence or the requirements for the continued existence of the site. So I assume the same thing will work for Teams. But we're considering moving to ShareGate Apricot when our licenses expire, because that's already included in our ShareGate subscription. So we don't know how that one will work. It looks a little bit more light.
Interesting.
But definitely having a tool makes it so much easier for us.
ShareGate Apricot. Okay, the tools that I've
Yeah.
really done deep dives on are AvPoint and Veeam. There's a couple of others which are more in the American market, and they don't really have a presence out here, so I don't bother with them. But that's an interesting one. I haven't heard too many people using it. Is anyone else using an automated archival system for their existing, or preferably for the on-prem SharePoint environments?
No, as I've said, we use record points, so we kind of headed. But just interestingly, we have been looking at the ShareGate Apricot as well, because I've just seen a demo from our Teams people, and I'm liking what I was seeing, because it actually gave you quite a nice bit of information.
It's a
not
nice
too much.
interface.
Okay,
Yes,
so
it
I need to go and look at that tool in more
Yeah.
detail, don't I? Fantastic. I've learned
Definitely.
something today. I like this
Yeah.
session. Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that we need to look at is what are the options for. Now, the challenge with things like AvPoint is actually AvPoint does a good job of looking across all these other data sources that Teams has, and you can apply other rules beyond SharePoint. They do have products in most of these spaces, but many organizations already have products in each of those spaces. So do you try and integrate them all together? The other question that I think I bring up later is, how do you rebuild? Let's say you have a major disaster with your team's environment. It could be a cyber attack or whatever. How do you rebuild that? It's not enough just to archive the components, but if you need to rebuild that entire context, that's something which is really difficult, and something I think people should be asking their I know it's not the same as archival, but it's certainly something they should be looking at in terms of backup, talking to their backup suppliers.
We use Veeam for our SharePoint environment backup. Does that have any components that can
Yes.
back up the broader teams? Okay.
So team Veeam, and we wrote a short summary of this. Veeam last month just announced that they have got, and demoed it to me, a really good Teams recontextualization capability. It won't, I don't think it's hitting general market until first quarter. I think it's a little way off. It may be out now for some people. I could be wrong on that, but certainly there are products that are starting to look at this. I don't know of any others that do what I've just said in the same way. So Veeam is certainly right up there, but I know AvePoint won't be long behind because they are an incredibly agile company too. But I'll take a look at the SharePoint Apricot, and it seems like something I need to look into in a little bit more detail. Archival. Actually, we sort of touched on some of the archival issues already just by getting into that discussion. But this is the archival we were just talking about, which is not just archiving the team's life cycle, but archiving everything within that's scattered through that entire team's environment. So one of the things is if you can take your archival policies and technologies that you already have and overlay it onto the slide I showed you earlier with all the different information sources where all the information is stored. It's a little bit of work, but I think it needs to get done. I believe that the best practice or the principle that you should adopt is take your existing archival policies and apply them. Now, that may change over time, but at the moment, I think that's the sanest way of getting this done at some level of velocity. It also, you don't need to create working groups and new committees and all that, so it is pretty agile. The better practices in this is that you probably do need to review your existing archival approaches and practices, which it sounds like some of you have already done. And there are the companies that we were just talking about. So we jumped ahead with that one. Excellent. Any questions, more questions on archival? Otherwise, we'll just move on. Okay, access control. So this is related to there's a couple of slides now which are going to be related closely together, but I have tried to break them out because I think it's worth thinking about them separately. This is who gets access to what information, or basically access to which team. And the principle is a really, really broad one. Sorry, I know it's overly broad, but this is because you really need to think about this in terms of your own organization's structure and policies. The principle is need to know. Now, the challenge is that when you invite someone into a team, they get to see pretty much everything which is shared into that team. And it is not uncommon. One of the big things that's happening is a team might get set up for a particular departmental need or a process need, and a document is shared into there that is directly related to that need, but somebody else is invited into that team who actually shouldn't have access to that particular document. They have a tangential requirement to be in that team. And as a result, you get oversharing. Now, this is far, far more common than even email accidental sharing. It's a real problem. So some of the other things that we need to be considering when we look at this is, are there walled gardens? For example, some organizations, certainly in the in healthcare, in case management, justice, in social services, you might need to build walled gardens between particular cases. How does that shape your access control into specific teams, which again can actually affect the structure of how you create teams? Who can grant access to the team? That comes back to that issue of who is the owner. Ultimately, that's where it comes back to. From a technology point of view, we have to look at what guardrails are needed for granting access. So if you've got an environment where any owner can invite somebody to a team, and that owner does not have necessarily the guardrails to say, just make them stop and rethink, should I really be inviting this person? What sensitive information is in this team that maybe they really shouldn't have access to? Do we need to deal with them in a different way? There are tools that can help with that. There are settings that can help with that, but we need to figure out how we're going to utilize those. And ultimately, it's got to be what are the guardrails. And here's the big one. Can external parties be given access? And if so, who? And a lot of folks, the common thing that I'm seeing is that folks are saying, we're going to turn off all guest access to our team's environment because we don't trust the fact that we're inviting external parties to look at potentially internal documents. And that defeats the purpose of Teams, in my opinion. It takes away one of the big advantages. So the better practices, if you've not got any form of DLP, data leakage prevention, you probably need to disable the guest access right now because information will leak like a sieve through these systems. You need to limit the granting of access rights because of this limitation around guest access. And now whether that's going through a help desk call center approach or whether that's a request of the IT department. Incidentally, I was just working with this morning with a government department, and they had to go to the IT department, luckily who we were dealing with, to set up a team environment for us to do work with them. So this is it creates a couple of days of lack of latency just to get through that process, but it might be worth it in your organization. The other thing I point out is a lot of organizations, and this stunned me, many organizations are not aware of Microsoft's built-in security capabilities, and they're evolving very quickly. Yes, there are differences depending on whether you've got an E3 license and an E5 license. We'll get into that in a second, but you need to be really over what Microsoft is doing in technology in security. And this is another interesting one. I haven't seen this done a lot, but I've seen, I think, 2 companies now do it, where they said, we are not allowing people to share documents natively inside Teams, but you can share a link to the IBRS system, which itself, for example, Records Point, the case in point, one of the case in point was actually a Record Point client. So you're not actually sharing the document itself. There's no way this can get into the wild. You're sharing a link into the IBRS system that already has those strict access rights. So you segment the team access, the discussions, the chats, the workflows, and so forth from where that document is stored. It does make it harder to administer. It's an additional challenge and overhead on the staff, but it's one way of really locking down access control at an object level. There are alternatives. So questions on this before we move on? Oh, excellent. Okay. So team member lifecycle. So you've added someone to a team. How long do they stay there? One of the things I wanted to point out on this is a specific note. If you remove someone from a team, their chat information becomes either invisible or deleted outright. Messages that they've put into the team itself will become unknown author. So before you remove a member from a team, if you're planning to have an automated process of that, you also need to have thinking about how's this information, the information that that contributor had to the team, where does that go? And then how is it accessed so that people in the team still understand who said what and when? It's another issue that Microsoft needs to address, I believe, and it's one of the things that we'll be speaking to them about, all going well. If they're brave enough to front up to the session I want to run. So the principle is if somebody leaves a team or someone is no longer required in a team, remove them, but find a way of retaining that context. And that places it in the near term, at least until Microsoft addresses this more fully, that creates a fairly tricky technical requirement on you to solve. The questions obviously are how are people added and removed from teams, who makes those decisions, when is membership reviewed, and so forth. Some of the better practices in this is Microsoft's IDM is pretty solid, and you can actually tie that into the process of automatically removing people, at least indicating when they need to be removed. It's not the only IDM that you can plug on in. Certainly take a look at your identity management tool set and figure out how that's going to work to guide this team member lifecycle. And the other part is, if you can, look towards automating the archival of the context of that person when they have left the team, so that at least there is some form of record, or records, plural, that folks can go back and go, oh, that was Bob Smith, who was a contractor. last year who lasted with us for 9 months, and this is the contribution he made, and here's why he made that, rather than just being some unknown random entity. So questions on that one?
Well, not so much a question, but I hadn't actually realized that that's what happened if members are deleted from the team. So that's an interesting one.
Yeah, that's my current understanding. I've not fully tested this myself, but this is absolutely what I'm getting reported.
Okay.
So yes,
looks like that would be a nightmare for audits.
Yes, yes, yes.
I keep telling people not to make decisions on chat.
But controlling that is challenging.
And
that's my biggest challenge.
Well, there is a perfect example of actually, I think one of the key issues about the governance is what are the usage, when do you use this? And by the way, as you add additional applications to Teams, this gets even more complex. It's huge advantages, but there is complexity here. So it's good that you're thinking about this. Okay, organizing teams.
On that last one, can I just ask quickly, with the archival of the information for members prior to removal, are there any tools or anything out there that can help us with that at this stage, or it's just so bleeding edge that no one's really onto it yet?
I have not heard of anyone with a solution.
Okay. Cool.
And as I said, this is why I want to flag it out explicitly. It is clearly an issue, and ultimately, this is an issue that I think Microsoft will solve, and I suspect they'll solve it within about 6 to 9 months. It's not too bad. It's such an issue, and they may already be working on it. They haven't told me they are. They may have missed something. I don't pretend, as I said, I'm not the fond of all wisdom in the world around this, but certainly this is a problem that other clients are facing.
I do know that Record Point have been talking about, I don't know whether it's there yet because I haven't talked to them recently, about being able to manage chat.
Okay.
From a records perspective.
That would be a really good approach, actually, if you could just make every chat go into a... Now, the question then becomes one of, well, I don't want my casual chats to go into the record system. This is meant to be a water cooler talk. So can you turn it on team by team or channel by channel? Wow, there's so much on this.
Yes, there is. It's a minefield.
It is. This one is actually a surprising minefield, and I didn't recognize it until about 3-4 months ago when it started to raise its ugly head as Teams usage grew. Organizing teams. Now, this is an interesting one. Microsoft is really good at tagging a lot of information, but in this case, they haven't done it. You can't put very easily. You can't put meta tags on Teams or even channels within Teams, and as a result, you can't get easy visibility of them with an automated tool. What I mean by that is it's very hard to go, as an IT department, show me all the teams that are dealing with medical history. I'm just using an example. And therefore, you can't automate putting policies across those teams, such as no guest access or whatever that looks like. And that creates this. It's a real problem for people who are trying to put those guardrails onto the team's governance. So what I see happening a lot, and this is actually, I think this is a major trend that Microsoft is just letting go, is that people are putting tags, information management tags, in the name, either as a suffix or a prefix in the name of the team. So instead of it being, medical case management team, cancer research, it would be, CTRP-001, and then the name. And then the IT groups are trying to automate this, can search for those pseudo tags in the title. I think it's a workaround. I think that Microsoft will probably fix it sometime in the future. It seems to me to be, it would sound to be a relatively easy thing to execute on from a software engineering point of view. But when you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of teams, then clearly the scale is an issue here, but it will get resolved. Anyway, the questions that I think, the principle is you need to get the organization to adhere some team naming conventions. Whether you do that through automation, as we talked about earlier, with the team's creation, and you enforce it, or whether you do it through recommendations, those are some of the questions that you need to have with the organization. The better practice is build team naming conventions into Teams, and that's a better practice for maybe, I don't know, 6 months, 9 months, whenever Microsoft will get around to fixing this. If you are going to put them in, if you are going to have a large number of teams, then you think you need to use this, then make sure that the naming, the prefixes and the suffixes, the codes you use make sense. Do not make it like I just said, TRP001. Don't do it. It might be, Cans Med Rec 2 or something along those lines, but make it at least moderately understandable so people can look at it and know what it is. This is not just for IT if it's in the name. And clearly, watch for the changes. I think Microsoft is going to have to address this one, as with the previous slide. I think it's something that I haven't heard is in the roadmap, but I can't see why it wouldn't be. Last one. And this, for me, is my personal bugbear, and that's information protection. If we go back to some of the previous discussions, I've said all the governance that we're putting in place is to try and limit the number of people getting access to the information that is shared in teams. It's about information access management. It's about the life cycle of information and so forth. The one thing that we haven't really addressed is, as soon as you open up teams, as soon as you get people working in this environment, they are going to want to share information. That's what this product does. And as soon as people start doing that, they will see incredible benefits from having co-development and co-sharing of these files. Our own research over the last years shows that folks who do this sort of co-authorship, rich collaboration, deep collaboration, the time required to create, say, a policy document or a strategy document or any complex, document reduces by about 30%. Not in terms of, that's in terms of elapsed time. In terms of human capital time, we think it's slightly, so it's probably only around 10%, but it's hard to get that metric. But more importantly, the amount of information in the document goes up by a considerable margin, 40%. So you get smaller documents in a shorter amount of time with more information and points in them. It's really measurable. In other words, better quality, faster. But that only happens when you are sharing information beyond your business boundaries and beyond your traditional boundaries. That's the disruption of collaboration. Therefore, information is going to be what I call in the winds. In the wild. So you can't assume that data leakage protection is going to solve that, because that is stopping the information from leaving the boundaries going to somebody who it shouldn't go to. But once it's gone to them, you've got no control over it. You actually need information protection at an object level. You can't rely on the informational border because you've got teams, unless you're switching off guest access, of course. So how do you protect that? Well, the basic principle is encrypt everything and only let people who've got the authentication to unencrypt that read the document. So the better practice is assume information is going to leak like a sieve. Do adopt the DLP approach to minimize the leakage, but that's really the guardrails. Explore Microsoft's they've renamed it from Azure Information Protection, AIP, level 1 and 2. They've changed that now to Microsoft Information Protection because they're Microsoft. They have to change the name every 6 months. But this is an environment where information is protected within your environment. It's encrypted. Not all of the information, but certainly the information that matters here, the files that are attached to teams. So if it ever got leaked, if it was ever accessed by somebody who, or rather, if they gained the file, somebody gained the file who shouldn't have it, they still can't open it. And not unless they're a state actor, maybe there's ways around this, but it's really, really hard. So Microsoft has this information protections solution, E3 and E5 licenses. There's slight differences between them. Honestly, the E3 license is all you need if you get your information management, your information tagged before it goes into Teams as being of a certain level of sensitivity. And that's a challenge. The better practice around that, which isn't on this slide, but it keeps on coming up, is do we create a really fine-grained information management plan for security, or do we keep it very, very high level? My recommendation is keep it high level to start if you've not already got one in place. So thoughts on this one, because it's a huge issue. It's the number one thing I think people need to be looking at as an immediate response to information leakage. Incidentally, there are other products which do this. You don't have to be all in the Microsoft camp. Is everyone familiar with Azure Information Protection, or the Microsoft Information Protection as it's now called? Who's familiar with that technology, that solution?
Yeah, we've deployed AIP as a fat client going back in the day, and now using the Azure AIP service, or MIP.
Yep.
It's just we're a government department, and we have lots of exceptions out there, and we have to follow certain standards for certain departments. We have to exempt other people, so it's going to be very hard to tag information across the board.
So, and again, that comes down to this problem of disruptive collaboration. My preference would be, yes, it's hard, do it. Spend your money there. Because if you don't, well, actually, no, that's not quite true. My first recommendation is seriously look at your information assets and say which ones actually need to be protected. And that's a surprisingly easy task to do. One of my colleagues has just done a piece of work with a utilities-oriented organization. And it's basically you talk to the senior executives in each line of business and you say, what would be the impact if this piece of information leaks? What information do you have, and what would be the impact if it leaks? And they'll always say, oh, it must never leak, it'll destroy us. And you say, really? Okay, let's talk about that. Why? What would be the impact? And usually at that point, they'll start paring it back, and you can normally get a fairly simple, 4 or 5 gradients of information protection that need to happen of different levels. Yes, I've made that sound simpler than it actually is, because you're dealing with politics as soon as you start dealing with the stuff, but you get the idea. But then anything which needs any level of, this can't leak to the public, it should be encrypted. So your approach, what's the approach that you've taken since you've been using AIP, or MIP as it's now called, for a while? What's your approach?
So it's our security team that actually run the policies. So we just implement them. But we have we run 11 directorates in 11 different departments with 11 sets of executives. So our justice department wants everybody to have labels and tag and encrypt. So they have it across their entire department. But the next department, health, don't want anything at all.
Yeah.
So we've got to just turn it on and off as we require, and then we're just hitting the mobility issues as well, especially with COVID, where now people want to access documents on their iPads or whatever else. So that's something which we're just trying to explore right now.
Yeah, these are really, really good lessons for everybody else. Yes, I'm not trivializing that this is tough, and what I am surprised is how few organizations actually know of these solutions that are baked into their existing licensing. So it's good to hear from a practitioner. By the way, Richard, where are you located?
So I work for the ACT government, so Canberra.
Right, ACT. Right, yeah. I know that some of the folks down in South Australia will be very interested to talk to you, because this is something which they're also looking at, and they've got like Canberra's got a single tenancy, which they're trying to figure out how do you then manage this information protection across multiple agencies with one tenancy. Real interesting use case.
We're actually in a bit of a weird situation, because we also have multiple tenancies where we've got our 11 ACT government departments under one tenancy. We have our education department underneath another tenancy with their students. We have the CIT people underneath another tenancy, and we've had to turn off guest access to Teams on all 3 tenancies, and now we're trying to reverse engineer that, so that they can actually talk to each other. So that's been a bit painful.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big lessons that we're seeing is a lot of people are addressing this problem. And this is something for everybody here. The short solution to this is turn off guest access, but it's not the long-term solution, and it also reduces greatly the benefits of something like Teams. So we do need to address it. The good news is, unlike some of these other problems that we've been talking about today, Microsoft actually has solutions for them. The hard part is they take a lot of thought to put into place. Have to be careful. So other questions or feedback on this one, because it's a really important slide. I know that we've only got a few more minutes to go, but I'd like to make sure everyone's happy with this one. Okay, so what's next? So look, here's a bunch of papers. I will send you all this presentation deck. So you can click on all these links and go to these papers. If you need one of them, you just reach out to Nick Bowman, who's on the line. Nick, say hi.
Well,
Yeah, there he is.
hello. Sorry.
So Nick, it's nbowman@ibrs.com.au, or reach out to me on the email here and request the paper. We'll be more than happy to have a conversation with you about it and make sure you get these. We've done a lot of work around this area. I also have a number of one-on-one sessions that can drill down on specific issues. In the last year and a half, certainly during COVID a lot, I was doing a lot of sessions with organizations, information management teams, because they are greatly impacted by this and they're very concerned. So I'm happy to have follow-on one-on-one calls and sort of unpack this a little bit more for your teams as you see fit. But please reach out to us. This is what we do. We try and head off problems before they happen. With that, I'll wrap up the webinar unless there's any final questions. Oh, okay. Was one there? Noreen? Yes?
No, I'm fine.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, great.
I just thought I'd unmute myself.
Okay. Look, and just following on from the previous session that we've run on this, the roundtables, I am going to be producing. There is more work to do in this space. I'm going to be producing effectively a short book, an ebook on how to go forward with teams and governance and so forth. So as I write that out, I'll make sure that I include you and get you a copy of that as well. And we will be trying to arrange a session where we've got practitioners who are our clients talking to Microsoft and putting their feet to the fire on some of these outstanding issues and seeing how they respond so that we can start to plan our longer term deployments. So I'll keep all of you informed on that. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a great session, and to all of you who raised questions and gave us some of your stories, fantastic. Thank you so much. Cheerio.
Thanks very much.
you.
Thanks, Joe.